Hello and welcome to today's video. It's me, Rebecca Jarman, bringing you Watercolour Wednesday. Today is episode 7 from my Back to Basics series, and I'm going to take you through all the different steps you need to create this daffodils painting for spring. So in the description box directly below this video, you'll also find a free PDF download of the reference image that I'm using in today's episode. So be sure to find that and print it off at home, and let's get started. So these are all the tools and materials you're going to need for today's class. You have access to the reference image that will be below the description box below the video, so download and print that off at home. And you're going to obviously need your watercolour paper. I'm going to attach mine to a board with some masking tape. You'll need 2 pots of water, one large to wash your brush in, a smaller one to use with the clean water to mix different colours to stop them from getting murky. And I'm going to use a graphite stick, HB pencil. I've got a range of watercolour brushes of different sizes, and my paints and palette as well. As well as those items, I'm also going to use a bit of a cloth just to dry my brush on and clean the brushes too. So to begin with, we're going to do the transfer technique onto the watercolour paper. So we're going to need the pencil and the graphite stick, and everything else can be moved to the side. Okay, so I'm going to turn my board over using the back of the board to place my image on top of. And what you want to do is, first of all, hold your image up to the light, and you should be able to see where your daffodils are from behind, and just draw a quick outline of where they are beneath. So you can see there that it's in the centre really of my paper, and what I'm going to do now is, using my graphite stick, I'm going to colour in, scribble across that shape, making sure that I'm covering everywhere I need to. And you can do it nice and quickly when you've got a large graphite stick like mine. If you haven't, if you're using a soft pencil, it just takes a little bit longer to cover this area with. But put down a good amount of graphite. You can see I'm not leaving any gaps. I'm filling with space. And it's nice and quick, just like that. Okay, so I'm going to hold my sheet back up to the light and make sure that I haven't left any. Oh, I can see that I need to just fill in that section there. I hadn't quite filled it. And just double check that you've got everything covered that you need to. So I'm going to have another little check, and I can see that all the daffodils are covered, including the stem as well. So now I've done that, I'm going to put that to one side, turn over my drawing board, and we need the masking tape next, and a sheet of your watercolour paper. So I'm using a 350 gram or 150 pound watercolour paper, and it's a medium cold pressed, or alternatively it's called NOT, N-O-T, and that's to do with the texture of the paper. So here's my sheet of watercolour paper, and I do have guidelines. Actually, you can see I've already drawn guidelines in the background as to where my paper can go. That's for when I'm actually stretching my paper, but for today I'm just using masking tape. This is a new tape actually, so just find the edge of your tape, and what you want to do is secure it down all 4 sides. Okay, so you can see I've secured all 4 sides so that the paper is firmly attached to my board now, and hopefully that will prevent a little bit of cockling when we apply the wet washes to the surface. Then the next step is take your reference image that you've coloured on the back of, and you're going to place it on your watercolour paper where you'd like it to be. And once you've got it in the right place, take another little bit of tape and you just want to secure it in one of the corners. So I usually go for the top left corner, and that way we can start tracing the image through and we can lift up safely without moving the paper about. It keeps it in that position. So we can move our tape and the graphite stick out of the way. We don't need that anymore. And what you're going to do is take your HB pencil. It needs to have a bit of a point on it so that it's accurate. And you're going to trace around the edges of the flowers. You need to put a fair amount of pressure down, so I'm pressing nice and firm and I'm following those edges of each of the petals. And when you get part way round, just have a little check. You can see here that I've got a nice dark line that I can clearly see, and continue in that way, tracing the rest of the image. And once you've traced it and you're happy that all the lines have transferred onto your watercolour paper, you can remove that reference image. Obviously you want to keep it to hand so that you can keep looking at the image while we're painting, and then we're going to set up the paints and things that we need. Now I'm just popped my brushes just into my water jar just to wet the bristles a little bit, and I'm going to take them out individually and wipe them off on my bit of cloth here. It's just an old tea towel that I'm using, but that's just to prepare our brushes because I've not used them for a few days and they were dry, so just to prepare those so they're clean with clean water on them, ready to go. Now the colours that we're going to use today are cadmium yellow, cadmium red and ultramarine blue. So those are the 3 primary colours we're using, and I'm going to take a pipette with clean water in, and I'm just going to pop a drop of water in each of those colours, and what that does is it actually helps to activate the watercolours. Now as you can see, I have a solid palette. These were decanted paints from tubes, so rather than having to unpackage my tubes and unscrew them and select the colours every time, I just took the colours from the tube, decanted it into my tray here, my palette, and now the paints that I use all the time are where I want them, and I just have to apply a little bit of water to activate them when I need them. So I've popped a drop of water in my 3 primaries, that's the cadmium yellow, cadmium red, ultramarine blue, and they'll be ready to go. Now if I show you the reference image, we're going to begin by painting a wash across the entire flower heads, and that's going to be the cadmium yellow. So if I just show you, if you've got a pipette, that's fantastic. It allows you to transfer a little water into your palette. If you don't have a pipette, just use a brush and you can dip it into the water like this and then pop it down on your palette like that. The the pipette just makes things easier. If you're doing a large wash and you need to transfer a lot of water, it just speeds up the process a little bit. So I'm going to take my number 4 brush, which is quite small, it's a round number 4, and I'm going to go into my cadmium yellow paint, which is a bit mucky, so I'm just going to clean it up a bit with my brush there. So I've got cadmium yellow paint on my brush and I'm popping it into that little puddle of water there. Now, if I were to actually test this out on a scrap piece of paper, so I've got a scrap piece of paper here and you can see that's quite pale. Okay, so there's not an awful lot of pigment, there's not a lot of paint in that. It's creating a nice pale yellow wash. And actually it's very similar to what we want for our daffodil. So I'm happy with that. So that'll make more sense the more painting that you do. I'm going to put my palette to one side and I'm going to paint this. Instead of painting it onto dry paper, I'm going to wet my paper first. This gives me more time to apply the paint and it stops us from getting hard lines. So that's what happens when you apply paint to dry paper and it dries before you actually completely finish your wash. So just applying some water to the flower allows me a little bit more time to get my paint down before the wash begins to dry. So you must take your time here when you're putting the water down, because anywhere that this water goes, the paint that you apply next is going to run into that water. It's going to want to move into the damp paper. So if you can imagine, if you were rushing this part, if I scribbled water into the background, my yellow paint is going to want to run into the background, and I want my background to be nice and clean and white. So if you take your time, use the tip of your brush to come up to the edges, and then you should be absolutely fine. And notice I haven't got great big puddles of water on my paper. I'm spreading this water around. I just want a nice even coat of water on the surface, and it can be difficult at times to see where you've applied the water because obviously it's clear and it's clean. So all you do, the little tip here, is to look from the side and you'll see where you've applied the water. It'll be shiny. Okay, now I'm in a heated room, so the water's going to want to dry pretty quickly, so I'm just making sure I haven't missed any sections. And as soon as I'm happy, I'm going to grab my number 4 brush, make sure there's plenty of paint on that, and I'm going to start here. You can see as I dab the water down, the paintbrush down to the surface, the paint wants to spread into that wet paper, into the water that's on the surface of the paper. And this is how we get a nice soft wash that's consistent across the surface. So just use your brush, fill it back up, apply some more paint when you need to. So go back to your palette and top up the paint on your bristles. And you want to move reasonably quickly now because it's beginning to dry. If I hadn't wet this surface before applying the paint, I'd have hard lines everywhere, because before I had a chance to come to the next application, what I'd put down beforehand will have dried, and so the paint that I bring up next to it will create a hard line, and that's what we're preventing by wetting the paper first. So the more paintings you do, these techniques will make a lot more sense to you. But by wetting that surface, I'm giving myself a bit of extra time to fill this flower in before it begins to dry. So I'm coming up to the edges with the bristles, the tip of my brush, and there we have it. So that's completely filled that flower head with that yellow paint. Okay, so I'm going to continue by doing exactly the same thing on the second flower head. I'll speed it up for you, but it's exactly the same technique, beginning by wetting the paper with clean water and then applying our application of paint on top. So now that we've allowed those flowers to dry, it should be completely dry before you do the next step. We're going to look at painting the centres. So these are a lot warmer, and if you look at your reference image, pretty orange actually. So the way we are going to create this colour is with the cadmium yellow and the cadmium red. So if I bring across my palette for you, I have a little too much water down here, so I'm going to take some of that out. This is just a bit of kitchen paper towel, and I'm going to go into, first of all, the cadmium yellow, and then cleaning my brush, and then into the cadmium red. Now you want to do this a little bit at a time, because a little bit of the red is enough to change that yellow very quickly, because the red is much stronger than the yellow. If I test what I have, let's have a look. So I think that is possibly a little bit too pale. So let's check it against my painting. Yeah, I want a slightly stronger orange, so I'm just going to add, I'm going to go into a bit more of the yellow. I want it a bit thicker, and then cleaning my brush and more of the red. So just do a little bit at a time until you get the kind of consistency and colour that you want. Now this is much brighter, and you can see the difference between the two oranges there, and I believe that one is much closer to what we have on the reference photo. So once you get a lovely orange that you're happy with, I am going to paint the centres, again wetting them first. So I'm going to use a smaller brush this time to wet. I'm going to use my number 4 because we're wetting a smaller area. We don't need to use such a large brush. So just going to again use the tip of your brush to be nice and neat and tidy around the edges. Into those little shapes, there's a lot of curves. So use the tip of your brush at the edges of that shape, and once you're happy that you've got that water down, I'm going to go into the orange and starting at the edges, you can see how much that splays out into the water. So it wants to spread nicely into that wet area. I'm going to go around the outside first and just filling the centre in. Now hopefully your lines are dark enough that you should still see them beneath this orange paint. So I'm just filling it out with that one colour across the entire flower centre. Just tidy up any edges if you need to as you go. And there we go. And I'm going to do exactly the same on the bottom flower head as well. Okay. And then once again, we're going to allow that to completely dry. While that's drying, I'm going to clean off my brush. And now we want to look at mixing a colour for the stems of the flower. So the stems are a lovely green, and we're going to use the blue, which is the ultramarine blue, with some of the cadmium yellow. So bring my palette across. So I'll use the top section this time. So a drop of water in that yellow that's already there. Going to top up the yellow with a bit more paint. Mix that in thoroughly so it's nice and consistent all the way through. Clean off my brush, and this time using the ultramarine blue. Now just be careful because ultramarine blue is very, very strong compared to the yellow. Much more powerful than the cadmium red. So just do it bit by bit, a little bit at a time. Thoroughly mix it in the palette until it's completely mixed together. And then a bit more blue, and just keep going until you get the sort of strength of green that you are after. And make sure you thoroughly mix that all in the palette, because if you have little light sections or dark sections that aren't mixed together, when you pick up the paint with your brush and you apply it to your painting, you might have dark and light patches in your painting. So as long as you thoroughly mix them, you'll be fine. So if I just move my painting up a little bit, I'm going to fill out this section. Now, although it seems pretty small, the area, just to be on the safe side, because you're beginners, I would just apply a little water first. So I'm going in with a bit of water all the way down to give myself a little bit more time to fill that in. It means you don't have to rush, and it's a lot less stressful, and it prevents those lines from occurring, those hard lines that you can get in the paint if it's not on a wet surface. So I've just added the green to my brush, and I'm going to fill in that space all the way down the stem, all the way to the bottom, making sure that I'm going right to the edges. And obviously it's a stem, so you want a lovely strong straight line if you can. So take your time, nice long brush strokes until you fill in the entire stem of that flower. Now I'm going to add a bit more blue to my mix to darken it up a little bit of blue in there so it's a bit darker. And now I'm going to use that blue, my dark green should I say, and I'm going to touch certain areas. There's a bit of a shadow down one side, so I'm just dragging that darker paint while the stem's still wet with the lighter colour, just dragging that down that right hand side. And what that does is it gives us a slight variation, and it makes the stem look a little bit more natural. So that's wet in wet. The two colours were both wet when I placed them down, and they blend together on the surface. So I'm going to just use the darker colour to fill in this little gap here in between the two flower heads. So that's the stem of the left hand flower reaching for the top. So just carefully painting that in. And that was on dry paper because it's a very, very small shape, so you don't need to pre-wet that. Now on this right hand stem of the flower, I would suggest that the top here, the bulbous section at the top, is a little bit paler than the bottom section. So what I'm going to do is add some of that darker green to some yellow over here on the other section of my palette to get a lighter green again. And then taking a clean brush with some water, and I'm just going to wet that stem all the way to the bottom. Now I have two different greens mixed up on my palette, and I can use them simultaneously. So I have the lighter green at the moment on my paintbrush, and I'm going to paint in this top section. So that's the bulbous part of the stem. I'm going to quickly clean my brush off and go back into the dark paint, and then I'm going to paint the bottom section of the stem with the darker colour. Okay, there's a bit of a shadow at the top here, so I can pop some dark down where I can see a shadow. Because that's still wet, I can place the paint in and it will blend nicely with what's already been put down. So just popped a little bit of a shadow under there as well. So hopefully that makes sense to you. So we've got a little bit of variation in colour on those stems now, which are looking quite nice. And we can check to see, yes, the centres of my daffodils are virtually dry now. And what I want to focus on now is, you can see there's some darker sections. Basically we're looking at the details. So there's some darker sections on the outer petals, the yellow petals, and some darker sort of shadows and lines. And there's some darker sections in the centres as well. So if we focus on the darker lines of the yellow petals, the outer petals if you like, I'm going to mix up, I've got a bit of water on my palette. Let me just check that you can see that. Yes, you can on the camera there. So I'm going to take a little tiny bit of the orange, pop it down. Now this is very pale because I've added some water to that. So let me show you how pale. That's very pale. Nice pale orange. So I'm going to use this colour on the petals. Now I'm going to use my smallest brush. So this one's actually a number 2. And I'm going to use my reference image as a guide. And I'm just going to have a look roughly where these lines occur and paint them in. So this is freehand obviously because we don't have any traced lines to go by, but if you just pop a few in, it gives the flower a little bit more character and shape. And I'm going to do that wherever I can see any lines or shadows, and they kind of radiate outwards from the centre. If you just pop in, you could even pop some in where you don't see them as well. You can just sort of have them radiating from the centre outwards. So it gives it a little bit of texture there. So I'm just going to do that in that way. So it's not exactly what I see on my reference image, but I've kind of gauged roughly what it's like, and then I'm using that to my advantage, and I'm just going to simplify it and bring out some of those marks. It starts to make the petals look much more three-dimensional. And then there's a couple of marks on this one here. Okay, so I'm happy with that. And I'll do the same thing down on the second flower. So sticking with the pale yellow colour, pale orange colour should I say, and just allowing these lines to kind of radiate out from the centre. If they're a bit hard, a bit harsh, take some clean water on that little brush and just touch some of the edges of that yellow orange paint we've popped down, and it softens those marks you've just made. It helps them blend in a little bit. So if your orange is a bit too dark possibly and it looks a little bit harsh, let me show you what I mean. If you use a dark orange, it's like this, Now look how obvious that is, and it doesn't look very realistic. So I'm going to take some water and I'm going to use the water to tone it down. I'm just tickling the bristles across that orange and I'm just blending it into the background a little bit. So that soften that off. So if you're getting very, very striking lines that are too obvious, just water down the orange a little bit. It might be that the orange is just too strong, and hopefully that will help. So I'm going to continue popping down a few little marks until I'm happy with what I've got here. So a bit of water, a bit of paint. It's quite subtle, but just enough to give those petals a little bit of definition. Okay, so I'm happy with that, and actually I believe these stems are now dry. It's nice and warm in this room, so things are taking a lot less time to dry, so that's great. Now, definition on the centres then. So what we need to do is strengthen our orange, and the way we do that is add more red. And if we use the tester strip that we created before, this is the original orange for the centre, and if I just mix up some more, adding a bit more red to the mix, a little bit of water. Now the orange you make needs to stand in front of this orange, so if you paint it on the top, if you can see a difference in that orange, which I clearly can on there, it stands out nicely, I know that that's strong enough to work. So I'm going to be painting similar marks on the centres. So I'm going to start on the outside edge, painting a little bit around the rim there, and just dragging some of that paint down towards the centres. Okay, so just painting a little bit of the rim and dragging it down. And again, you can have a little bit of water on a separate brush, clean water, and you can soften those edges if they're too strong, if they're too harsh. Just soften it with a little bit of water and it will blend them in. And just work in that way, so painting around that rim there and just dragging some of that orange. So I'm going to suggest that your centres are a little darker than the outer edges, if you like. So this is the outer cup here at the bottom of this one, and I'm going to make that lighter and my centre darker so that you can distinguish between the shapes, and then soften with a little bit of water. Okay, so yeah, I'm happy with that, that's fine. And then I'm going to just paint on a couple of fine little lines coming down the outside edge of the cup as well. So again, very harsh because it's a dark orange, so I'm just softening it with a bit of water, and it creates a little bit of texture, a little bit of shadow, and it helps to define the shape. So I'm using two brushes at the same time. One is wet, just with clean water, and one has my orange paint. Okay. Now I'm just layering it up a little bit as well. You can work on top of it until you're happy with what you have. So there we have it. Those are our daffodils, and they're just drying off a little bit, and I wanted to give you some tips as to how to remove the paper from the board. So when you're taking the masking tape off, just be careful that you pull the tape away from your painting, away like this. Don't drag your tape this way, because if it does happen to pick up some paper and tear the paper, it's going to tear into your work. At least if you tear the tape away like this, then if it does tear, it's not going to damage your painting. So you just remove it nice and carefully. Don't be too quick about it, be gentle and hold the paper down with one hand and pull away with the tape away from your painting with the other hand, and you shouldn't get into any problems. So the final strip, just holding it down with one hand, I'm pressing down on the paper firmly with this hand, my left hand, and removing it with my right. So now that it's dry, I've made my lines quite dark so that you can see it clearly on the camera. I'm using a putty rubber now, and any edges that I haven't actually painted over, I can remove with a putty rubber. So there's a few edges that I can lift away. You can do the same thing. So normally what I would do is I would use the transfer technique to get the lines in the correct place, and then before I start painting I normally lighten all my lines with a putty rubber so that they are dark enough for me to see and follow while I'm painting, but not too dark that they are going to be, you know, very visible at the end of the painting by the viewer. So just use a putty rubber rather than an ordinary rubber to do this, because they can damage the surface of the paper. Especially if you're sort of lifting this graphite up before you start painting. You definitely don't want to do that with an ordinary rubber. If you damage the surface of the paper, it's going to affect the way the paper absorbs the paint. So definitely, if you don't have a putty rubber, I would recommend you buying one. But unfortunately, a lot of my lines have been painted over with the paint. So for example here you can see that the paint has gone over that pencil line, so I've not been able to remove that, unfortunately. But for the sake of the purposes of this video, so that you could clearly follow my demonstration, I had to pencil them in quite dark. So we've used a few techniques today in this painting. We used wet in wet for the majority of it, giving us time to get the paint down before the wash started to dry, and that helped us prevent any of those hard lines from forming. But we did also do a little bit of wet paint on dry paper to add some of the details at the end. We used wet in wet with two different colours simultaneously across the stems of the flower, and that's allowed us to create this lovely soft variegated wash on those, and it makes the flowers look much more realistic, I think. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial with me today. So this is Back to Basics episode 7, and we've painted from start to finish. I've shown you step-by-step instructions how to transfer your image onto the paper, then how to mix the correct colours, and obviously the different ways of applying the paint as well. If you've had a great time with me today, give me a like for this class, and also consider subscribing, because every Wednesday I release a new video. It's Watercolour Wednesday with me, and I like to show you new techniques and step-by-step demonstrations each week. So give me a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in next week's episode. Take care.